Beauty and the Beast, a real prince, cursed by his own people. In the late 1500s, inside the towering stone walls of the Canary Islands, a child was born who would become legend. He did not cry like most babies. He howled. His skin was pink and soft, but his body, his face, his chest, even his back, was covered in thick, dark hair, coarse, unrelenting, like an animal. The midwives recoiled. The mother, noble by blood but trembling with shame, could barely look at him. They had no name for what he was. He wasn't sick, he wasn't deformed. But he wasn't right. They called him a monster. And by the time he was 4, they sold him. This is not a fairy tale. This is the true story of Petrus Gonsalvus, the real-life inspiration behind Beauty and the Beast. Not a cursed prince transformed by magic, but a brilliant, gentle boy imprisoned by the ignorance of kings and the cruelty of courts. And unlike the beast in the fairy tale, Petrus didn't turn into a man. He was always one, but the world refused to see him that way. In Renaissance Europe, wonder was currency. If you were born with 2 heads, they put you in a parade. If you were a giant or a dwarf, you were gifted to royalty. Exoticism was status, and the stranger your appearance, the more powerful men wanted to possess you. Petrus was the ultimate prize. He had a rare condition, what we now call congenital hypertrichosis. Only a handful of people in human history have ever been recorded with it. His entire face was covered in thick hair, like a wolf's pelt. He looked more beast than boy, and yet he could speak. He could read. He was calm, curious, even regal. So the court in Spain presented him as a living wonder, a wild man tamed and educated. But behind every public display was a cage. He was paraded, not introduced, gawked at, not respected. And then he disappeared. Years passed. No one knows how he was transported or whether he was kidnapped, sold, or gifted. But by the age of 10, Petrus Gonsalvus had arrived in France, at the royal court of King Henry II. To the French nobles, he was an amusement, the wild man of the woods, a beast they could dress in fine clothes, teach Latin, and marvel over like he was a pet who had learned to recite poetry. But Petrus was no spectacle. He mastered languages. He studied philosophy. He wrote in a hand as elegant as any royal tutor. King Henry, recognizing his intelligence, did something radical. He gave him status. He placed Petrus in the court, not as a servant, but as a nobleman. He was groomed, taught court manners, and treated, at least in appearance, like a man of station. But only so far, because no matter how polite he was, how brilliant, how loyal, every whisper in the marble halls still called him the Beast. No woman was allowed to look at him. No title was ever truly his. He was nobility in gold lace, still locked in a private zoo. And the worst part? Petrus knew it. One day, King Henry made a wager. It was a game among nobles, a cruel one. He would arrange a marriage for Petrus, but not just any marriage. He ordered that a young woman be chosen, a beautiful one, but common, a merchant's daughter. She was told nothing, only that she would marry a man of importance, a courtly match, a royal blessing. She arrived in white silk, and when she saw her groom, she froze. Not because he was hideous, not because he was cruel, but because she'd been lied to. This was not a prince. This was a beast. Her name was Catherine, and history has tried to erase what she felt that day. Some say she screamed. Some say she tried to flee. Others say she stood perfectly still. But no one recorded what Petrus did, whether he spoke to her, whether he apologized, whether his eyes, deep and quiet, tried to tell her he understood. They were married, not because they loved, but because a king ordered it. Now imagine their first night, the silence, the fear. 2 strangers, one born to be a wife, the other cursed to be a man no one could love. But over time, something strange happened. They didn't fall in love like fairy tales. They grew into something deeper. They had 7 children. 4 of them inherited their father's condition. Hair-covered faces, sharp features. But like him, they were brilliant, gentle, gifted. And like their father, they became property. Noble courts across Europe requested the children be sent to them as curiosities. Some were sent to Italy, others to Germany. They were painted, measured, studied, paraded, all while their father watched. And still, he said nothing, because Petrus Gonsalvus was more than the beast they imagined. He was patient, he was watching the world, and he was waiting. In portraits, Petrus is dressed in noble clothing, ruffled collars, velvet sleeves. But his face is never retouched. The painters did not try to soften him. They painted every hair, every tooth. And yet, his eyes are human. More human, in some ways, than the kings and queens who owned him. In one painting, Catherine stands beside him. Her hand is resting gently on his sleeve. It's the only known image of the two together. And it doesn't look like a spectacle. It looks like a family. It looks like endurance. It looks like love, not in the romantic sense, but in the survival sense. 2 people, bound by a lie, who built a life anyway. Not because they were blessed, but because they refused to break. The world never knew what to do with them. In France, they were passed to the Medici family in Italy. Catherine was renamed Beauty in royal correspondences. Petrus was simply called the Wild Man. But the truth was clearer than legend. He was not wild. He was not cursed by a witch. He was cursed by his own people, a society that could not accept what didn't fit its mirror, a kingdom that punished the different, no matter how noble they became. And so the story of Beauty and the Beast was born, not from magic, but from power, from cruelty, from the uncomfortable truth that real love grows not in gardens, but in cages. After their forced marriage, Petrus and Catherine might have expected to be forgotten, left to live quietly behind palace walls, far from the mockery of court jesters and the eyes of kings. But the Beast and the Beauty had become a fascination, and now their children were the next exhibit. 4 of the 7 children born to Petrus and Catherine inherited their father's condition, dark hair growing over their faces and bodies. But they were not monstrous. They were healthy, bright-eyed, and like their father, they could read, write, sing, and dance with the court's best. But none of that mattered. To the ruling families of Europe, they were living curiosities, scientific wonders. God's little accidents, as one noblewoman reportedly wrote. And so, without ceremony or consent, the children were taken, given away, distributed, like gifts. In Florence, the Medici family, one of the most powerful dynasties in European history, took in 2 of the children. They were educated in fine schools and raised among the Italian elite, but not as equals. They were studied like rare animals. Artists were commissioned to paint them, not as portraits of loved ones, but as specimens. Their images survive today. A young boy in a noble red tunic, fur covering his cheeks and forehead. A girl in a high collar, hair curling down her nose like a mask. They stare from the canvases not with pride, but with confusion. The kind only a child would have when dressed like a prince but treated like a pet. Even their names were altered. They were called the Hairy Children. Never Petrus's son, never Catherine's daughter. Not even their human names mattered anymore. They were mythologized before they ever had a chance to be people. Back in France, Petrus and Catherine tried to maintain their dignity. They corresponded with their children when they could. Letters traveled slowly, often intercepted by scholars or clergy, who wanted to examine their handwriting, their vocabulary, their intellect. To many, the children were a living contradiction. They looked like beasts, but wrote like scholars. This confused the Renaissance world deeply. After all, the Church had long preached that outer appearance reflected inner virtue. that to look monstrous meant to be cursed. But here were these children, hairy, yes, but kind, fluent, thoughtful. They weren't sinners, they were just different. And that terrified people more than any fairy tale. At some point, Petrus realized what was happening. His life had become a warning, a lesson, and now his children were following the same script, their humanity dismissed, their intellect stolen for other men's lectures, their likeness captured in paintings but never in memory. He began to withdraw from public life. Catherine, too, grew colder in court appearances. Her smile vanished from letters, and the family began moving, first to Parma, then to Capodimonte, trying to find quiet in a world that refused to forget their faces. But they were never truly free. Wherever they went, the story followed. The wild man and the woman who loved him, the beast and the beauty. What most people don't know is that the version of Beauty and the Beast we celebrate today wasn't written until over 100 years later, by a French novelist named Gabrielle Suzanne de Villeneuve. But she didn't invent the story, she borrowed it, from court gossip, family records, and quiet legends whispered through the halls of European castles. She took the truth and polished it. In her version, the beast was cursed by a fairy for being cruel. The girl, Belle, chose to love him despite his appearance. He turned into a handsome prince. They lived happily ever after. But none of that was true. The real Petrus never changed form. He didn't need to. He was already a man. But the world needed him to be a monster because it couldn't face what he revealed, that the line between man and beast was not one of biology. It was one of fear. And what of Catherine? She was never named in the fairy tale, never described beyond her beauty. But she was far more than a symbol. She was a woman caught between power and pity, forced to marry for spectacle, then forced to become a mother to children the world would never see as hers. Yet through it all, she stayed. Not out of romance, not because of some magical transformation, but because of something greater, defiance. Catherine did not flee. She did not abandon. She did not bow to kings who laughed at her family. She raised her children with pride. She wrote letters that scholars still study for their elegance. She stood beside Petrus in every portrait, hand on his sleeve, eyes level with the painter. In a world that called him beast, she saw a man, and that may be the real fairy tale. Not love at first sight, but love forged in survival. By the time they reached old age, Petrus and Catherine had become quiet legends. They lived in a small home near Lucca, Italy, surrounded by books, letters, and fading memories of courts that once fought to possess them. Their children, now adults, were scattered across Europe. Some found peace, others were lost to time. None returned to their birthplace, but Petrus and Catherine remained, together. Not because they were myth, but because they were more than that. They were real, and they endured. By the mid-1600s, Petrus Gonsalvus had stopped being a novelty. He had become a question, not just a curiosity to be studied or a marvel to be admired. He had become a problem that Europe's greatest minds couldn't solve. In drawing rooms and royal courts, in the halls of medicine and philosophy, men debated what Petrus represented. Was he human? Was he a beast gifted with speech? Or was he living proof that everything they believed about nature, soul, and appearance was wrong? Because Petrus didn't fit. He didn't belong in their categories of man and animal, noble and savage, divine and damned. He blurred lines that had stood for centuries, and that terrified people more than his appearance ever could. Europe at the time was built on rigid ideas. Beauty meant goodness. Deformity meant sin. Outer appearance reflected inner worth. And here stood Petrus, covered in fur like a wild animal, yet polite, multilingual, intelligent, and moral. To many, he was a paradox. To others, he was a threat. Priests debated whether he had a soul. Doctors dissected his condition. Philosophers used him as a case study. And all the while, Petrus simply lived. He wrote letters to his children. He managed his household. He watched quietly as strangers tried to define his humanity. Theologians clashed in pulpits and parchments. One insisted Petrus was a divine punishment, a beast born into man's world to remind humanity of its sins. Another called him a test, proof that the soul had nothing to do with skin. Physicians, meanwhile, labeled him with increasingly bizarre names. Homo ferus, wild man tamed by civilization, the missing link. But Petrus was not missing anything. He had everything: mind, dignity, purpose. What he lacked was a world ready to see him clearly. In Florence, scholars recorded his children's handwriting like they were rare scrolls. In Genoa, Catherine's letters were copied into royal libraries, proof, they said, that even the untamed can be taught. Even love was twisted into experiment. Petrus and Catherine's marriage, once whispered about as unnatural, now became a symbol, one manipulated into a moral tale. Beauty civilizes the beast. Intelligence redeems the savage. The noble heart beats beneath the fur, and it sounded poetic. But it stripped them of their truth. They didn't need redeeming. They needed remembering. Over the decades, Petrus's legacy evolved. His story was told and retold, shifting with each version. One painter softened his eyes. A poet described Catherine as an angel sent to tame a creature of the woods. But the reality was more human and more powerful. There was no fairy magic, no enchanted castle, just a man who looked like a beast and a woman forced into a marriage, who stayed. Not because she was under a spell, but because she chose to see what others refused to. By the time the Enlightenment began sweeping Europe, Petrus was no longer alive, but he was very much alive in conversation. Philosophers debated whether humanity could be measured by reason alone. If so, Petrus passed every test, yet still they hesitated. Because Petrus exposed the flaw in their thinking, that reason and beauty had anything to do with each other at all. He wasn't a contradiction, he was a correction. A reminder that true humanity is not found in the face, but in the heart. And by simply living, he proved it. Petrus Gonsalvus died quietly. No funeral parade, no statues, no royal decree. Just silence. A man once paraded as a marvel, discussed in salons, painted by court artists, and whispered about by kings, disappeared into the fog of history. No grand chronicle recorded his last words. No public marker preserves the spot where he was buried. His legacy, once alive in letters and portraits, faded not by accident, but by design. Because the world didn't know how to remember him, so it chose to rewrite him. After Petrus's death, his children scattered across Europe. Some lived under noble patronage. Others, history loses entirely. Their names, once so precious to scholars, fell off royal rolls. Their portraits ended up in forgotten vaults, mislabeled, misinterpreted. What remained was the story, but not the truth. Catherine was renamed. Petrus was renamed. The children were renamed. Soon they weren't a family at all, they were a fairy tale. A tale of a beast cursed for cruelty, a beauty who saves him through love, a transformation into a handsome prince. It sounded familiar, but it wasn't real. The version we know today, published by Jean-Marie Le Prince de Beaumont in 1756, was short, moral, and romantic. It erased Catherine's strength, reduced Petrus to an enchanted animal, and turned their children into an afterthought. The wild man was no longer a man at all. He became a metaphor for redemption, for patience, for taming. But in doing so, the story removed the most powerful part, that Petrus needed no magic to be worthy. He had always been a man. It was the world that needed to change. Even as the fairy tale became famous, the real man vanished. His portraits were reattributed to fictional characters. His letters were stored in obscure archives, if at all. His family tree dissolved into rumor. And with time, only the Beast remained. When Walt Disney released Beauty and the Beast in 1991, it became an instant classic. The castle, the spell, the enchanted rose, all beloved. But the movie never acknowledged the family that inspired it. The man, the wife, the children. In modern museums, Petrus is still featured, but often under titles like The Wild Man or The Hairy Gentleman. His face is shown, but his name rarely appears. And so, a man who once stood as a challenge to the very idea of human worth was reduced to a silhouette in a bedtime story. That is how myths are made, not with lies, but with careful forgetting. But now the world is remembering. Historians are digging through dusty archives, uncovering letters and paintings long ignored. Biologists and genealogists have traced the Gonsalvus condition through time. Scholars are beginning to write again, not about the beast, but about the man. And what they find is not a legend. It's something better. A legacy. One built not on fantasy, but on perseverance. On quiet dignity in the face of spectacle. On a marriage that was arranged by cruelty, but transformed by endurance. Petrus didn't need to turn into a prince to be powerful. He needed only to outlive the lie. So the next time someone tells you fairy tales aren't real, tell them they're half right. The magic might be fiction, but the courage, the pain, the survival, that was real. The beast was not cursed by a fairy. He was cursed by ignorance. And the woman who saved him didn't do it with a kiss. She did it by standing beside him, by never looking away, and by teaching the world that you don't need to be beautiful to be human. Fairy tales aren't just stories. They're reflections. They show us what we fear, what we want, and most of all, what we believe. And few tales reflect us more clearly than Beauty and the Beast. But when you peel away the magic, when you strip away the castle, the spells, the talking candlesticks, you're left with something deeper. A man, misunderstood, judged, paraded, and still unbroken. Petrus Gonsalvus was never a monster. He was made into one by a world that couldn't explain him. He was cursed not by magic, but by how people saw him, and what they refused to see. Yet he never stopped being a man. He loved. He raised a family. He wrote. He studied. He outlasted the kings who tried to define him. And in doing so, he gave us something greater than a myth. He gave us a mirror. Because in truth, the beast was never in the fur. It was in the eyes of those who couldn't look past it. And beauty? Real beauty? It wasn't in Catherine's face. It was in her defiance, in her choice to stay, in her refusal to let the world dictate what love could look like. We tell fairy tales to children, but the best ones are for adults. They challenge us. They hold us accountable. They remind us that what we mock, we misunderstand. That what we fear, we often don't know. Petrus's story doesn't need enchantment. It is already filled with wonder, because it proves something timeless, that a man with fur can show more grace than a man in gold, that a woman forced into marriage can become a force of her own, that a family called monstrous can be more human than the ones who watch them. And maybe that's the real magic. Not transformation, not spells, but endurance, living with dignity when the world says you don't deserve it, loving boldly when the world tells you not to, choosing to write your own ending, even when the storytellers try to steal it from you. So the next time you hear the tale of Beauty and the Beast, remember, the beast was real, and he was never a beast at all. He was a mirror, and what we saw in him was always about us. This is Uncle Luke Tells, where the stories behind the stories come to life, where the forgotten are remembered, and where even the beast gets to speak. Like, comment, subscribe, and share this with someone who still believes that love should only come wrapped in perfection. Because the greatest tales are the ones that tell the truth.